Maybe we'll start off by quick introductions while we wait. Let's start with Ari over there.
Yeah, hi, Ari Redboard. I am the global head of policy at TRM Labs. We are a blockchain intelligence company, which means we work with law enforcement, regulators, financial institutions to mitigate illicit finance risk in crypto. Prior to joining TRM about 5.5 years ago, I spent about 11 years as a federal prosecutor at the U.S. Department of Justice, and then about 2 years at the U.S. Treasury Department, overseeing the national security apparatus there.
Brian Colligan, founder of Alpha Growth. We are a DeFi strategy firm, mostly working with protocols, ecosystems, helping them grow. On the other side of the fence, ex-hacker turned, good crypto guy, and now I'm just helping other protocols keep safe and grow them.
Hi, how are you? I'm John Lensner. I'm a late-minute addition to the panel, but I'm a partner at Fenwick & West, a law firm where I focus on government enforcement, investigations, and crisis management. I've been here for about a year, and before that, I served as the chief of staff of the FBI, and then before that, as the U.S. Attorney for Maryland. Great to be here.
Thank you. And I'm Shaylee Adenolfi. I lead business development for Stacks, Bitcoin Layer 2. We're about to launch a Bitcoin staking product. Stay tuned for that. And I'm just moderating this panel. So the name of the panel is called Crisis Management. There have been a lot of interesting crises in crypto over the years, and we can talk about some of the history and lessons learned. But I kind of wanted to define kind of how we deal with crises given the fast movement of crypto. Because in traditional finance and government, you have systems and processes to deal with crises, right? In crypto, things are you learn about things sometimes on Twitter, and you're just like going through feeds and trying to like match wallets and things like that. So maybe I'll start with Brian, because he's experienced some interesting things recently to get us kicked off on this topic.
Cool. So two quick stories. Like Sunday morning, about a year and a half ago, I get a call. I get another call. I'm like, who the heck is calling me? And this governance proposal went through on a DAO where somebody got enough votes to vote themselves $25 million of Treasury like out of the blue. Right? That's like one example of a crisis. So those governance attacks dealt with. And then the other one that was just recent, in January, we're working with a chain called Saga. And there was this, we brought around 44 million in TVL. We're on track to do 100 million TVL on the chain through DeFi. And in a span of 25 minutes, $6.7 million worth of token was taken before the chain was able to identify it. Everybody was able to message it and shut it down. And we could talk, so I'm happy to talk about either one of those things.
Yeah, I mean, so governance and then like stolen funds, and any others you want to add in terms of categories?
It's funny, right before walking up here, you said, we're going to start out by defining a crisis in crypto. And all I thought to myself is like, what is not a crisis in crypto? Every single morning I wake up and I don't know what the crisis of the day is going to be, but there's going to be one. And I think in large part because we're always responding to these large-scale hacks, as you were kind of getting into. Think any law enforcement investigation in a case involving crypto. Think, I get reach out every day from victims who've lost millions of dollars to scams and fraud. So, it's probably definitionally, it's a lot of different things. But really excited to kind of dig into what a response looks like, because I actually think, if there's sort of no takeaway, at least from my piece of this, it's that we can do this a lot better in crypto than we can in the traditional space.
One thing I'll just add, in addition to what my colleague said, is a crisis could be a hack, an intrusion, ransomware. It can be a theft, funds that are stolen. But also, you see now increasingly, like even just a social media post or a media story that's breaking very quickly can lead to a larger crisis. And so I always tell my clients, like, look, you can't write a playbook or a blueprint for every possible crisis that you're going to see. So rather than trying to anticipate everything, it's better to just have a general framework, a system, principles, that as a foundation, and you can use that to adapt to any kind of crisis that comes over the transom.
Perfect. So I'm going to go to something that Ari said, which is the response. What does a response look like in that first 24 hours from kind of like your experience in dealing with different types of crises?
Terrific. Yeah. Let me kind of do two pieces to that. So I'd say like in the first 24 hours, you're like too late, particularly if you're in like the latter of that 24 hours. And I think that's what's really so extraordinary about crypto is funds move at the speed of the internet, right? The promise of this technology, why we are all here, why are we all in this space, is cross-border value transfer at the speed of the internet. We can now move funds faster cross-border than ever before, right? For humanitarian aid, for remittances, for payments at scale, right? We saw $4 trillion in stablecoin activity last year. But bad actors can now move funds faster across border than ever before, and they can convert them to more usable fiat currencies at the speed of the internet. And I think that, so in terms of like, you need to have someone who's tracing the flow of funds immediately, right? I love that we have a lawyer on here because I think oftentimes so many of these crisis responses are you have to have a lawyer quarterbacking it, you bring in a TRM labs, you bring in experts, and then you start kind of going from there. Just the last point to put on this is that, to me, it really is all about speed. I think that we realized at TRM, I don't know, maybe a couple of years ago, that oftentimes this is moving too fast for compliance, for transaction monitoring, for quite frankly the types of tools that we've built. So this is not self-serving. So we created this thing called the Beacon Network, which is the largest kind of public-private information sharing network in crypto. And what we did is we reached out to Coinbase and Binance, right, the two largest exchanges, and said, hey, we need to stop funds from off-ramping as fast as they can in a crisis situation like this. And they were in. And then we reached out to OKX and Kraken and blockchain.com and crypto.com, fintechs like Robinhood and Stripe and PayPal. And we married that ecosystem with about 70 global law enforcement agencies. And what they're doing is they're flagging illicit proceeds in real time, sending out alerts, think Beacon, think Lighthouse, to those exchanges, to Binance, to Coinbase. And then they're immediately working to block, interdict, and seize those funds. So I kind of use that as an example of like, we have to move fast because bad guys now are moving faster than ever.
I love that. When did the Beacon Network start? This is awesome.
August. Yeah, it's really cool.
Okay.
Yeah.
Moving fast. Brian, tell us what it looks like at the protocol level, because it's a different perspective there.
Yeah. Two different cases. Like one was the most recent one I'll go over is what it looks like is spinning up a war room on Telegram and then trying to get enough data as possible and stop the bleeding, right? So that's like the number one. Once you recognize that something is wrong, what can we do? How do we stop the bleeding? I would say the difference between like 2 years ago and today is radically different. I saw like, so it was a chain, so there's four or five protocols involved. I got chills because this was the turning point for me of kind of an AI in general, where it's like, oh, it's kind of like a fun little tool to like, these four founders, they turned on this scanning device. They turned on, exactly was able to like find and pinpoint the direct transactions in the codes. Something that would have taken like 3 or 4 weeks to determine like how big of a exploit it is. They were able to determine it in like literally like 30 minutes to an hour between these like four founders. And spin up on it, and this person had an AI report, this person had an AI report, they had AI reports going against each other to like figure out what was real and what wasn't real. And so the crisis, in a span of like, money was out the door in 25 minutes, 2 hours in, the root cause was found and how bad the exploit was. And by the time we were 3 hours in, we're reaching out to like TRM Labs and another vendor to start tracking, because they had gone through, in 3 hours they had done the exploit, got the USDC out, bridge, transferred it to Ethereum, and then had it in Tornado Cash in a span of 3 hours. So what it looks like, and when you see that and you watch that, like just, to Ari's point, is like the speed at which that and the response, like you have like zero time to like really take an effect. And I was really happy with the the response aspect of it, and it was amazing to watch and see. But at the same time, now that we think that it's still in tornado cash to this day.
I want to stick to this kind of like at the protocol level topic, because I know from a DAO perspective, there could be some voting involved. And sometimes you can't reach, the people that need to do the vote quickly enough, and that becomes very tricky. And then the people that are going to vote, is there legal liability associated with that? Like, how do they make decisions in that process if it's like a VC, a highly regulated VC, for example? Tell us what that looks like. Paint the picture for us.
Yeah, so generally, if it's somebody, okay, so I was working at Compound Finance during 2 different episodes of a quote-unquote attacks. And it's interesting, there's these VCs that will not vote on particular scenarios have a lot of influence on how to drive the DAO. And it's all for like a good cause. I think the weird thing is that at the protocol level, that the really strange thing is that there's a culture and idea around like how a protocol is supposed to operate that isn't necessarily like the rules of the game of how it's laid out, and then those things have a clash, right? So I'll give you an example. There was a takeover. $25 million was coming out of the Treasury. If they didn't cancel the proposal, about 50-50 wanted to cancel the entire token and remove all governance capability for the token. And now what that means is, do you stop $25 million kind of like governance exploit, and what would be the impact of a $400 million token if you cut away the governance? So there was this weird conversation of like, at some amount of an exploit that has potentiality, will you cut off the reason the token exists and the utility of the token? And the calculus was between how much is the exploit versus how much market cap will get hit. And some people didn't care that the market cap of the token got hit because they no longer hold the token, but they're still part of that culture. And so you have like 3 different things in play there that were extremely challenging.
Actually, can I ask a question? How long, what was the time that conversation took place? Like,
over the course of 48 hours. Yeah. So and people are in different time zones, and people have like different schedules, and it was from a Sunday to a Tuesday. So it started on a Sunday. The group came up like Sunday afternoon to like Tuesday, back and forth. Yeah.
TradFi's got nothing on us. You want to share what that 24 hours looks like, that first 24 hours from your perspective?
Sure. I think, in my experience, when you get that first phone call from a client in a crisis, so much of it is 2 things. One is getting with the client and getting with the core team. I always tell companies when they're forming and they're getting and they're growing to like, hey, today when it's a sunny day out, before the storm comes, not like it is in DC today where I got drenched walking over here, but like, clear day, take time to do things like think through who is the core team that will be making decisions and sharing information. What is that secure communication channel that you all are communicating on, which to share information, make those decisions? What's the escalation process? When do you go to the board? How do you go to the board? Things like that, which don't take a lot of time, but once that crisis hits, you want to make sure that you are talking to the key decision makers. You have one person sharing the facts because you don't want to have competing narratives, especially if later on there's a lawsuit or some kind of government inquiry, and now they're looking at competing narratives in your communications. And so I always say, like, we'll get the key decision makers on a Zoom or on a call or on a channel, and we're going to talk through what we know to be the facts. And the lessons are learn, fix, tell. And those are the kind of the key immediate steps that I always try to, what are the key facts? How do we fix it, contain it the best we can in the first 24 hours, and then tell it. Because you have stakeholders, you have key audiences, customers, people in the community who are wondering what's going on, and they're going to fill that vacuum of information if you don't. And sometimes people debate about, 24 hours, do we put out a statement? When do we put out a statement? And look, you don't want to put out information too quickly because it could be wrong. And you also don't want to tip off the bad actors if there are certain things that you don't want them to know. But on the flip side, you risk every minute that goes by someone else filling that void on Twitter or X or Discord. And so I always say, look, even put out a statement that says we're aware of the problem, we're addressing it, and we'll share more information when we have it to share, and always reaffirm your principles and values at the end. Sometimes that goes a long way in that first 24 hours.
Yeah, now, we've had several of these, across protocols happen, some really high-profile ones. So that decision-making, regulators are looking at that, and I'm just curious how they've evolved, because you all have been there with them, alongside them, educating them on how to deal with these crises, right? And tell us what is the regulator's perspective on crypto crises like handling today, and how has that evolved?
No, it's a great question. It's probably a range. One thing, this might be slightly more sort of policy making than regulators, because I'm not sure how far along regulators are in the conversation we're in right now. I do think certainly like trying to understand what is expected of a compliance team in response to a hack, response to sanctions. But one thing that's interesting, and hopefully for this group in particular, is this is not necessarily a centralized crypto issue. Like you were talking about sort of what is happening at the protocol, and I mentioned Beacon. Look, we have DeFi members of the Beacon network. We have protocols, Rhinify and 1inch and Railgun and a whole handful of others. They're not working with law enforcement to seize illicit proceeds, right? They don't have compliance teams. They don't have that function. But what they are doing is automatically blocking Beacon alerts. So when they're getting an alert that illicit proceeds are about to hit your platform, they're getting an alert and they'll go ahead and block those funds. And they normally go to some other protocol somewhere else within the ecosystem, but hopefully we're following the money there and then onboarding that platform to Beacon to sort of cut that off. And I say all of this because it's a little different than sort of that crisis response, that incident response, but I've been asked so many times, we briefed 8 Democratic senators, I don't know, a couple months ago on market structure and this question around DeFi. And there's this perception that you can't do anything or won't do anything in our space. And the reality is there's so much we can do and can use the technology to do that we don't sort of need to over-regulate. And I think it becomes like a really important piece to this is showing off how we can use the technology in these circumstances.
That's awesome. I love that. Maybe Stacks
I don't
should
think
join.
they listened, to be honest, in the briefing, because then they came out with this crazy thing the next day. But like, we try.
Yeah. I want to like kind of go back to this like high-profile sort of case, because recently, I don't know if you guys saw, but Ari was on CNN talking about Savannah Guthrie's mom and the Bitcoin kind of like ransom. I don't know how much you can share about that, but what you can publicly share, it would be interesting for this group to hear.
Sure, that's interesting. I don't think of that as much as like this crisis response, but it absolutely is. It absolutely is. I guess what I could talk about sort of is the more public nature of this. And the questions that were being asked really were like, isn't Bitcoin anonymous? That's how everyone starts, which just made me think that I was been terrible at my job for the last 5.5 years, but we try. But I think that in that situation, everyone is doing exactly kind of like what some of this conversation is about, except it's really driven by law enforcement. You want to make sure that you have that address. So the address is in the ransom letter, and if you're the FBI, you want to make sure you have that address, and then you're using tools like TRM to see what's going in and out of that address ultimately. The problem, and the reality is that if it's an alphanumeric address with no attribution in our tool, right, it's one use for this specific case, and no payment has been made, we don't see activity. What you're waiting there for, though, is for those funds ultimately to